Hello, and welcome to Aspects of Japanese Studies. I am Junko Habu, the chair of the Center for Japanese Studies, and I'm the host of today's show. Aspects of Japanese Studies is a talk series that showcases the research being conducted by faculty, grad students, and alumni of the CJS. Each speaker will present a casual 15-minute talk on her or his ongoing project or key research topics in the field of Japanese studies. We'll be doing a short Q&A session after the 15-minute talk. For those of you joining us live today, you can submit questions at any point during the talk using the chat function. Please do not use the Q&A function. So today, I am delighted to introduce Professor Gregory Levine of the History of Art Department. Greg is a historian of the art and architecture of Japan and Buddhist visual cultures. As a historian of Buddhist visual cultures and eco-art history, Greg is currently editing a student author volume, You Must Not Look Away, Letters to the Next Generation from Students of Eco-Art History, and he's at work on the book, A Tree and the Buddha, Imagining Arboreal Art History, and several other books. He's a recipient of the Guggenheim and many other fellowships. The title of his presentation today is Carved Alive, Buddhist Tree Icons, Tachikibutsu in Japan, and Eco-Art History. Please welcome Greg.
Thank you very much, Junko. I hope you can hear me. And thanks everybody for joining in different time zones and geographies. I have a lot to get through in 15 minutes, but I'm hoping that it will go smoothly. It's really wonderful to be able to contribute to this series. And I look forward to questions and comments after I speak. So what do tree icons tell us? Tree icons, or tachikibutsu in Japanese, are images of Buddhist deities carved into standing and living trees, a practice that begins in the 7th century. As such, tree icons are not representations of trees and Buddhist deities, but are images represented directly in trees. For this reason, the question, what do tree icons tell us, rubs against the grain of conventional art history and humanistic privileging of artifacts and epistemologies. This is because the tree icon's presence, and indeed its future, is partly determined by the tree as an active non-human being. Tree icons therefore invite questions such as the following. Why do humans carve icons directly into trees? What did it take for a carver to cut an image into a tree? And what does this practice suggest about icons, Buddhism, and our relationships with non-human species? These are indeed complex questions, and I think they're made still more complicated by the fact that it's difficult, at least for some of us, to separate our study of visual material things from the crisis of petrocapital-driven atmospheric heating, extractivist ecosystem destruction, mass extinction, and environmental injustice. In other words, our imperiled future looms over tree icons, whether we like it or not. Now, some of you may caution that casting tree icons into our present disastrous mess is a foolish sort of presentism, an anachronistic misuse of the past. But if capitalism is accelerating us into a biospheric death spiral involving the destruction of forest ecosystems, there is something uncomfortable now about history itself, as it is threatened by anthropogenic forces that may wipe out the past and future. That said, we need to be strategic about this, and there are a couple questions that I think will help us move through this complicated situation. How do tree icons help us think about human, non-human relationships then and now, and potentially in the future? And what might tree icons suggest for the humanities? Now, these are questions that are entirely coherent with the so-called ecological turn in the humanities itself. I have very mixed feelings about the so-called ecological turn. Indeed, I find myself wondering just how ecological is it really? But one of its premises is that mitigating environmental destruction and injustice going forward is not strictly a matter of technocratic solutions, but of human values, ethics, and consciousness itself. For early anarchist and socialist writers concerned with ecological relations, down to present-day eco-socialists and others, including those engaged in post-humanist philosophy, the goal is not only to supersede capitalism's oppression with revolutionary equality, it must also be the case that most modern humans, not all, must develop a consciousness of dialectical and mutual relationship with the environment. In other words, we need to change our minds from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism. Now, this is all very easy to say. It smacks of a kind of high elevation humanities speak. And as any eco-socialist and others will admit, it's very difficult to imagine this happening. The question then is, how do we work this out on the ground, or in the present case, with trees and images? Or to put it another way, can tree icons help change our minds? If tree icons can change our minds, it will probably be due to the fact that they force non-human being upon image carvers, images, and viewers, and they disorient our sense of what a visual image is, because it is now biologically alive and ecologically in place. One can ignore such rooted living ontology, but what a glaring suppression of the arboreal other this would be, not to mention a refusal of analytical and philosophical possibility. What happens then if we take the trees in tree icons seriously, give them a seat at the table, so to speak, and not merely as the substrate in a material sense for an image? What if we refuse the extraction of the image from the dialectical arboreal entanglement? Now, in a global biocultural sense, we're talking about what indigenous communities sometimes refer to as message trees, and trees that mark sites of initiation and burial, and also what anthropologists and ethnobiologists call arborglyphs, vivifacts, and so on. These are images cut into arboreal bodies with systems themselves of circulation, respiration, reproduction, healing, and also particular modes of communication. This is all something that the biological and ecological sciences have made quite clear. Cutting into living animals, meanwhile, is what we refer to as vivisection, and carving into a living tree also enacts a relationship of bodies and force, with human power, tools, and kinetics deployed on non-human being. Now, all human actions, image-related or otherwise, have material and ecological contexts and costs to one degree or another, and therein lies an ethical predicament, not a new one, but one that may seem especially pressing today. So what do tree icons tell us about this kind of predicament? What do they tell us about the arboreal ontology of a human-made image? Now, Buddhist tree icons are few or far between among the thousands and thousands of Buddhist icons in Japan, those conventionally carved from felled, sectioned, and dried wood. Tree icons are really an oddity in art history. Even so, Buddhist legends refer to numinous trees that reveal themselves to be deities by giving off light, emitting voices, and so forth. And it is the figure of the charismatic monk or nun who makes the deity visible by carving through a tree's bark and cambium into woody material, creating an image that is as much arboreomorphic as it is iconographic. Just like a conventional icon, meanwhile, a tree icon often becomes the ritual heart, the hub of a temple community. But as a tree icon, this is an instance in which the human carver goes to the tree rather than to already sourced wood, and ritual space is constructed around the tree icon, rooted where it is. Excuse me. In 815, for instance, the Buddhist monk Kukai discovered a glowing tree along the riverbank of the Seta River in central Japan that revealed itself to be, in fact, in its true being, its true form, the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, or Kannon. In the legend, Kukai's tree icon, which he carved himself, and which we see at the upper portion of the detail on the right, became the kind of iconic hub or centerpiece of a particular temple named Annyoji, which still survives today. Now, the icon that Kukai is alleged to have carved, which still survives, and we see it in one of the few photographs taken of it in 1961. This is an icon that is considered a secret image. This image, the statue, certainly postdates Kukai's lifetime, but it does appear to have been carved initially in a living, rooted tree. And for a while, it remained rooted and alive until, for some reason, it was cut at its base and then enshrined in a more conventional manner inside a temple building. The image was therefore untreed, if you will, and this is perhaps because the tree died, was suffering decay, or the temple's ritual or social needs changed. Most medieval tree icons that we encounter today have been similarly untreed, and this is true as well of the very famous icon at the temple Chuzenji, whose main statue today looks, for all intents and purposes, to be a conventional icon carved in a Buddhist sculpture workshop. But what might this practice tell us about Buddhism and icon making, and also about Buddhist responses to the natural world? In this short talk, I can only give you a few observations that I admit will be entirely unsatisfactory to most of you for their simplification. But to begin with, Asian religions have ancient and continuing cultic traditions focused on numinous trees and tree spirits, though not all of these traditions involve carving into trees. Buddhist principles ideally prohibit intentional injury and killing of other beings, at least in an ideal sense. And we might propose, again, ideally, that harvesting wood and carving icons produced a karmic risk that required some mode of ritual remediation. But it is also abundantly clear that Buddhist image making in Japan placed immense material demands on old growth trees and forests of specific species, especially those of cryptomeria, and that the demand for wood far exceeded, was even greater, for temple construction. This karma of extraction, if you will, to the extent that it mattered to a Buddhist community, would have required a great deal of reparation. And adding complexity, meanwhile, are Buddhist debates about the sentience of plants and trees, their potential awakening, and the non-human's ability to preach the Dharma. This is a very complex issue indeed. We may well wonder, though, did such debate impact the question of the vivisection of trees in order to reveal the divine to human eyes, or whether there were other agendas, competing agendas in play? Now, these are important questions that I'm not going to fully unpack, partly because I want to go in a different direction, but we might also consider the phenomenology of tree carving itself. How would a living tree determine the work of a carver, their tools, posture, the timeline of their work, and other conditions, in contrast with carving done in an interior workspace? Now, to imagine this situation, we may turn to this representation from the 18th century of the monk Enku, famous for rough-cut icons that retain wood grain and growth forms. He produced thousands of images. In the illustration, Enku is shown carving an icon into a Calopanex septemlobus, the deciduous castor tree, on the grounds of a temple known as Senkyoji. And though the illustration is retrospective and hagiographic, the artist suggests that the unusual efforts required to carve the image into a tree were somewhat extensive, intensive, if not far-fetched. We see Enku stretching upwards, nearly too far it seems, on an impossibly thin ladder to accentuate the eccentric or the outlandish or perilous nature of his work, with his hatchet raised to strike into the tree. It all seems very far-fetched and awkward indeed, but Enku's blade has already fallen. We see a glowering face emerging from the trunk, though no body yet, of the deity. A farmer steadies the ladder, counterbalancing the kinetics of Enku's cutting, and a merchant, palms together in worship, witnesses the image brought forward from a tree. Now, this, of course, is retrospective, but it does suggest the ways in which this particular type of practice may have been perceived, at least in the late 18th century, and in the context of this biographies of contemporary eccentrics. But historically and materially, however fierce and powerful Enku's tree icon may have been, and he did in fact cut two tree icons, It did not avoid the decay that occurs in all beings and objects. In this case, from temple records and the remaining statue itself, a case of root rot. And faced with this biological process, entirely natural and ecological, the temple cut down the tree icon in 1808 and enshrined it inside a temple building. And on the right, we do see the surviving tree icon itself. For the temple Senkyoji, like Annyoji and Chuzenji, the image therefore was ultimately of greater value than the tree icon's biotic and ecological system. It needed to be rescued from decay for the sake of its iconic and ritual, and also, one might add, economic presence. So much for the doctrine of impermanence and the pop Buddhist mantra, just let it go. But let's not avoid the first order issue of what carving means for the tree. As any tree biologist will tell you, incisions cut into a tree kills growth-related cells, disrupts water and nutrient flow, and gives access potentially to insects and pathogens. The tree's cambium bleeds. Thus, while the completed image may be salvific to humans, it is wounding to the tree. Tree icons, we might say, thus expose a biopolitics of human image making. But even so, this is not an entirely one-way street. And the biotic reality of tree icons is more complicated than this, more dialectical, and indeed less anthropocentric. The carving and wounding of a tree is merely a human action, one human action, in the tree icon conjuncture. For the tree will release chemical compounds and send out electrical signals when it is cut, just as human tissue does when it's hurt. And to avoid infection, the tree must seal the wound as fast and as much as it possibly can. This process engages the image with arboreomorphogenesis, as the tree closes new growth over the wound, i.e. the image, in a healing process that produces its own, at least for humans, biovisuality, and perhaps for other species as well. And you can see this in the folds of bark beginning to enclose over this very recent 20th century tree icon in Kyoto. Tree icons then are not simple symbiosis or peaceful Buddhist interdependence. They are contests of living bodies, of the carver, icon, and tree. This wound healing process is, of course, simply a matter of trees being trees. And in this process, the trees insinuate themselves into human visual poesis. The human materialization of the divine through the image may therefore face sylvan resistance. And over time, iconography and iconic presence may reshape into something else because of the action of the tree. Unless, of course, there is human intervention. Here on the right, we're looking at a fairly recent photograph of the tree icon carved by Mokujiki at Gangyoji. And on the left is a much earlier 20th century photograph by Yanagi Muneyoshi. And you can see that by now, the tree has continued to encroach upon the icon. As the tree responds, the icon as wound is resculpted, we might say, through self-healing actions. If human material cultural practices inevitably wound other species to one degree or another, tree icons tell us something, they show us something about this wounding process and the process of response and healing, potentially. But it goes without saying that this is all very foreign to conventional art history, favoring as it does the origins, facture, reception, and preservation of the image. Tree icons, therefore, may provoke a different sort of art history, and perhaps even a different way of perceiving, thinking, and describing the world. Within an anthropocentric image world system, such as that of conventional art history, tree icons are therefore radical, unknowable, strange conjunctures in which the agency of the tree competes with and may even indeed exceed human agency. Not only do trees incite human image making in the first place, they then trouble these images to the point that humans frequently intervene to preserve the image despite the tree's physiology and life-death process. The trees take their own time, their own tree time, making trouble for the image. But in this slow drama, the visual image, the human-made icon, becomes less of a thing and more part of a system. And nature, quote unquote, is not the background of the image, but foregrounded dialectically with human perception, image making, and belief. A tree icon, and indeed perhaps any image then, is not strictly ideational, aesthetic, or even simply material in a human use value sense, but a biomaterial system constituted through active human, non-human relationships. In our present ecological peril, of course, we are acutely aware of such interrelationships, especially as they move from being unnoticed or incremental to extreme and right in our faces. Insignificant as tree icons may be in the immense scale of human culture, let alone the eco-catastrophe, they embody nevertheless the biomaterial and biopolitical dialectics of human, non-human ecological being in complex relationships of difference, metabolism, competition, and interreliance. And through their oddity and wonder, they may help us prefigure, look ahead to different modes of thought that are responsible to other species and Earth systems, and as a matter of our own species' survival. For art histories and the humanities, then, tree icons suggest that the ecological turn should not be thought of merely as a way to better understand human artifacts as being environmentally situated, but indeed as a way to better understand human cultures as dialectically complex human, non-human relationships. Art history then may need to shift from an object-centric to an ecocentric ethics. And if we think of tree icons as, quote, zones of emergence, to borrow a phrase from Joel Covell, places in which we can think about the unthinkable, a world beyond capitalism and anthropocentrism, perhaps tree icons will, ever so slightly, change our minds. Thank you.